Requeening hives can be intimidating, mostly because it's tough to find that old queen. You know, when you've got a double deep hive like this and you're trying to requeen it, that's a lot of frames of bees to go through and hopefully find that old queen. So that part of it can be really tough. There's a couple things I really recommend. If finding a queen is hard for you, I recommend making a split. You know, it's way easier to make a split, you know, divide these resources in this double deep equally among maybe 3 deep boxes, put 4 frames of brood or 3 frames of brood in each split. Make your split, separate all the boxes, and then come back in 3 or 4 days and see which of the boxes has eggs. And now you're looking for a queen in a single deep box with 3 or 4 frames of brood and 5 or 6 frames of bees, instead of, you know, looking for a queen in this big huge hive. So go ahead and make a split and then look for your queen. That makes it much, much, much easier. The other thing that can be really helpful is if you cannot find the queen, if your hive isn't really, really mean, you can actually shake all the bees out of both boxes into the front of the hive and then put a queen excluder between the bottom board and the bottom box. Wait about an hour, all the bees will actually go right back up into the boxes, and then you can look, you can take the 2 boxes off and look underneath that queen excluder that's sitting on the bottom board, and that queen will be trapped up underneath that queen excluder. Now that's obviously a lot of lifting, a lot of shaking, and that's not easy either, but you don't have to actually find the queen looking through the frames of brood anyway with that method. But overall, my favorite method is to make a split, and then you're looking through a lot less bees 3 or 4 days later to find that old queen. But let's say you do want to go ahead and requeen a hive that's a double deep hive, or maybe it's a deep and a medium. There is no good way to do it other than just digging in and looking for that queen. I usually start on the 2nd frame when I'm looking for a queen. And I also am looking for frames that are mostly brood and have areas for the queen to lay on. So, you know, this is a frame full of capped honey. She's not going to be on this frame in most cases. Now, sometimes she'll prove me wrong, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time other than a quick glance looking for the queen on that frame. Now, I set that frame aside, and then I'm looking as I'm getting ready to pull this next frame out. I'm looking at the frame still in the hive, because sometimes I'll often see the queen as she runs down the facing frame, because she doesn't like the sunlight. She'll often run down the facing frame, and it's easy to see her when she turns and runs down. So before I look at this frame in my hand, I actually look at the frame facing me still in the box. If I don't see her there, then I look at this frame. Now, our tendency is to hold the frame flat in front of our face like this, but then you really have to look at every single bee. I hold it at an angle and kind of skim my eyes across the top of the frame, and I find it's much easier to see the queen that way rather than looking at every single bee on the frame. So then I just go through the entire hive like this, 1 frame at a time. I try not to spend more than 10 or 15 seconds looking at each frame. If you spend much more time than that, then there's a good chance that the queen will actually run down into the bottom box in the frame. She'll run into the bottom box or onto the bottom board, and you'll never actually find her. So again, I'm just repeating this process, looking at the facing frame, then looking at the frame at a downward angle, skimming my eyes across the tops of the bees, and I don't see her in this top box. So I'm going to replace the frames, and again, trying to move fairly quickly, and then we're going to look at the bottom box. If you have a friend or a family member that can help you look at these frames, that's incredibly helpful to have 2 sets of eyes rather than 1 set of eyes as you're looking for that queen. So, when you're done looking at the frame in your hand, you can pass it on to someone else and they can take a closer look before you move on. That can be really, really helpful. You also don't want to use a ton of smoke, because that can really make the bees run a little bit, and when they're running, obviously it's harder to find that queen. Okay, so here's the old queen. So I'm going to grab her, and this is the most painful part. I'm just going to pinch her and kill her, and then throw her out of the hive. Now, it's always a debate. You know, do you leave the old queen in the hive so the bees know she's dead, or do you remove her completely? I like to remove her completely. That way the pheromones leave the hive much quicker. At this point, you could wait anywhere from 2 to 24 hours and add your new queen. I don't always mind actually adding her right away. If you're going to add her right away, what I recommend is that, here's our queen cage. So if you're going to add her right away, this is our queen cage. So this is our candy. You can see there, this is the end that has our candy in it. If you're going to add her right away, I would get a piece of masking tape and just cover this end that has the exposed candy with the masking tape, and then poke a few small holes in the masking tape with a toothpick. And this will slow the bees down by about 1 day, accessing that candy and releasing the queen. You can see the bees landing on the cage because they smell the queen. So I'd put a piece of masking tape on it and slow the bees down by about a day. And if you do that, then you can requeen all in one trip, and you can go ahead and install the queen on this trip and not have to come back to the hive. If you don't want to do that, you can just come back within 24 hours and install the new queen in the hive. But when you put it in the hive, I like to put it right in the middle of the bottom box, and you're just going to pry the frames apart as much as possible, and then you're going to insert the cage just like this. The candy can be facing up or facing down, it doesn't really matter. Facing up is slightly better because if any bees die inside the cage, they won't fall down and cover up the candy. So you can leave the candy facing up or down, and then you want the screen to stay exposed. So you're going to insert it into the hive between the frames with that screen exposed. And 1, 2, 3. Yeah, so this hive actually has 9 frames in it and a feeder instead of 8 frames in the feeder, and it's a little too tight to get that cage in. So you can just remove a frame to give yourself a little bit more room, pry the frames apart, slide that cage right between the frames, candy side up, push the frames back together tightly, and you're done. So you can often still fit that extra frame back in at this point, or you can just leave it out and come back in a couple days and replace it. And simple as that. So I'll come back to this hive in about a week and make sure that that queen was released and that she is out and laying. When you do that follow-up inspection, I don't want to be in the hive more than about a minute or two, because a new queen that the bees are still getting used to her pheromones, they're a little more apt to kill her if those pheromones are dissipated by opening and looking at the hive for too long. So I'm going to look pretty quickly, only spend a minute or two. I'll basically go in, look at those middle frames, and I should see eggs on those middle frames. If the queen was released and I do see eggs, I'm going to close it up, and I'll come back in a couple weeks and check again. But if I don't see eggs and the queen was released, I'm going to close the hive up, give it another 2 or 3 days, come back and check again. If I still don't see eggs, then I usually am just going to leave that hive. I'll give them a few frames of fresh brood from a stronger hive and let them raise their own. Because at that point, they've probably already got queen cells that are getting fairly close to hatching elsewhere in the hive. If I install a new queen and it takes them 3 or 4 or 5 days to release her, there's a good chance a virgin queen will hatch about the time that second queen is released, and that virgin queen will typically kill that mated queen. If I don't see any queen cells anywhere in the hive at all, then I might go ahead and try to install a new queen, but just hunt really well for eggs and larvae and make sure that she isn't out and laying and you just don't see eggs and larvae. We do have a couple videos on our YouTube channel about how to see eggs and larvae that might be worthwhile checking out so that you can make sure you can spot them before you spend money on an extra queen.